We want to talk about shaft extensions, and I'm going to first talk about extending a steel shaft. And the most common method of extending a steel shaft is going to be using a steel shaft extension. These are extensions that we sell in different sizes. This happens to be a 600, what we call an S60 for a code, a 600 extension, because I have a 600 butt diameter shaft. It is a double extension, so there's an extension at either end. This can be cut in half and used to extend a golf club. We find the size to make sure it properly fits inside the golf shaft and fits snug. We sand it just as though we would sand the tip of a shaft when we're doing shaft installation into a club. Also can be a very good idea if you have a large wire brush, or take some sandpaper that you can roll up to abrade the inside of the shaft, or at least take acetone and a Q-tip and swab the inside of the shaft to clean it so that you have good clean surfaces for your epoxy to bond to. At that point, we would mix up some epoxy, and I would recommend the high impact epoxy for doing shaft extensions, and this would be glued together and left to dry, and then come back and cut it. I also recommend, generally when I set a club with an extension up to dry, I always set it with the club head, if you will, facing the ceiling, and the extension setting on the ground. May want to put even a piece of cardboard if it happens to be pretty warm, because the epoxy could run down through the shaft and could end up gluing it to a bench or something like that if you don't put something down there. But that will also keep the epoxy from running down the shaft to where it could break loose, and a piece of it could break loose and cause a rattle later on. At times we've even taken in a steel shaft, taken it and put it on a vise, take a punch it, roll it, punch it again, just basically as a way to secure it, so that if for some reason the epoxy did fail, that the extension wouldn't come out. You need to be aware that when you extend a graphite shaft, that is your liability. I don't know of any graphite shaft company or steel shaft company or graphite shaft company for that manufacturer that will warrant a club that has an extension in it, so be careful and sure of what you're doing. I've always worked personally with a rule of thumb that I won't extend a club more than 1 inch. I know there are some cases that you may go a little bit more, or some people who may feel a little bit more comfortable going longer than that, but again, it is a liability issue that you have to be careful of. There is a leverage point that's created under the hand, so you always want to be very careful when you're doing an extension and be comfortable with what you're doing as well. We also do have aluminum extensions that can work with a steel shaft as well. They come into the different sizes. Those work very well also. We have what's called a universal extension, which goes down inside the shaft and then has a post that goes down inside to force this out so that it will fit into many different size shafts. About the only installation I found that it could not be used in was some steel shafts that had a 560 butt diameter. The post going in was already too big and wouldn't compress down small enough. But for larger steel shafts, for example, like TT Light steel shafts, taper tip steel shafts that have a 620 butt diameter, the universal extensions work extremely well there. So that is another option as well. Primarily, if at all possible, though, I like to extend steel with steel. I like to bond similar materials. Another option, if you don't have an extension, or if you happen to save some of the old broken steel shafts that come in for repair, I've done this in the past too, that generally if you keep a butt section of the shaft, you can find where it will properly fit. In the case of this one, that's a nice fit. And I could come back and I could cut a post off of that step, sand it, install it, come back and cut it to length. Rule of thumb in a case like that, make sure the post that goes down inside the shaft is longer than the amount you're extending it. So for example, if you were going to extend a club 1/2 inch, make sure the post is at least 3/4 of an inch. The other thing, if you're trying to do this with old pieces of steel shaft, make sure you find one that fits. Don't get into a situation like this shaft where it doesn't quite fit and then over sand this trying to make it fit. If you do that, you're going to break down the temperance of the material. More than likely that one's going to break. So don't force it. Find one that fits well, and generally, especially out of lightweight steel shafts, you can find something that works pretty well. Okay? So moving over to graphite shafts. With graphite shafts, we have different types of extenders. We have thermoplastic extenders. We still have aluminum extenders. We still use some wooden extenders, and I'll also still show you being able to do that with, or to explain that we can still do that, or that we can do that with an old piece of graphite shaft as well. One of the things to point out, we sell primarily two graphite extenders that we sell most often. One is coded GSE, one is coded USGE. And the difference in these two extenders, they're both outside diameter, and the top of the post are sized to fit a 600 butt diameter shaft. But the difference is the size of the post. On the USGE, it has the bigger post, which measures approximately 530. The GSE has a smaller post, which measures approximately 590. Where this comes into play, for example, I have a Graphoid Proforce 55, Proforce Blue 55 or Gold 55 gram shaft. It's a 600 butt diameter, but because it's 55 grams, it has thinner walls, meaning that the hole inside the shaft is larger in diameter. So for that, we need a larger post, or we need a USGE to fit into that lighter weight shaft. And you're probably going to use USGEs to shafts probably up into the close to 80 gram range. You get 80 grams or heavier, then you start getting into thicker walls, and there's more of a chance that you're going to need the GSE to go in and fit into that shaft at that point because of the thickness of the walls. And that's the difference in those two extenders primarily. Same rule of thumb applies in this case. If I were putting this extension into this Proforce 55, I have come back and I have lightly sanded this extension so that it'll properly bond. I could again lightly sand the inside of the graphite shaft, or at least take again some acetone and a Q-tip to clean that out. Again, high impact epoxy is what I would recommend. Glue that together. This time we always put all of the posts in there because the posts are sized off the very bottom and off this little edge right below the lip here. In between, it actually gets a little smaller in diameter, so we have to maintain all of the posts when we put this in. Glue it in, let it dry. Again, I like to set it in this position when it dries so that any epoxy would run away from going down inside the shaft. Come back and cut it, and again, even with graphite shaft, I stick to 1 inch as a rule of thumb on the length of an extension. As we said, we also have aluminum extensions. The universal extension will work with some of the graphite shafts that have larger butt diameters. I did test this with like an Alval NV, and there were a few NVs that this would work with. However, there were a few that it wouldn't work with either because they taper so quickly inside that this wouldn't quite fit, and we still had to use actually a USGE and kind of make it fit a little bit there. We could also, as I said, take an old piece of graphite shaft. We used to do this early on because we didn't have graphite extensions at that point. So we would take a piece of graphite shaft, find where it would fit inside the shaft, cut it, and then again sand it, abrade or clean the inside of the shaft, epoxy it together, and then we could just take masking tape to build that diameter back up to the same outside diameter as the shaft. That's an alternative method if you get in a bind and you don't happen to have an extension. We also still sell wooden extensions for graphite shafts. The nice thing about wooden extensions is that they can be sized by sanding them very easily. May not be the best in every case, although they seem to bond very well. Again, I'm going to say I like to bond similar materials, so if I can bond graphite to graphite or the thermoplastic type of extension, I would much rather bond those two types of materials. So those are our rules of thumb and our explanations of extending both steel and graphite shafts.